Right, I'm getting ready to put the rear wheel back in because the wheels have come back now from the shop with lovely new tyres on. We've gone for Avon Road Riders because I think they're a great tyre. They've got a nice tread and they're that bit cheaper than the TT100s. I love the tread on the TT100s as well, but they're that bit more expensive. So we've got nice tyres. I think this has got a wider, must have a wider rim, I'm sure, than standard on the rear. I think so. So we've got a wider tyre than standard. Are they both 19-inch rims? I think they are. I should have checked really, shouldn't I? But that's definitely got a wider rim on it, and obviously they've got it so it clears the chain. Anyway, we're getting ready to put that on. So what I've done is I've put the chain guard back on. Now I've cleaned everything back there, and the first thing I did actually was to feed the new chain through as planned, put the temporarily fitted the split link onto the old chain, then use the old chain to put it through, because even with the Z plate and everything off, it's still a nightmare to get to that sprocket to feed the chain onto it. So that made life a lot easier feeding it through. I've put the Z plate back on, I've polished that back up, put that back on because that's all clean behind, and so I'm all happy with that, and it doesn't interfere with taking off the primary chain case. The main thing to note with putting the chain guard back on is there's a spigot here, and the chain goes over that spigot with a bolt in it. Okay, that doesn't actually bolt to anything, it's just sort of firms up the actual chain guard itself. It's only bolted at the front and here on the shock absorber mounting. Also, if you remember, when I took it apart, I found out that this had been catching on the rear exhaust hanger. When I've actually examined it, it's not been catching on the rear exhaust hanger. That has obviously been ground down deliberately. So I can only assume it was ground down when it was sort of assembled by Norvil, and they ground a bit off so it wouldn't catch on the exhaust hanger. So I think it was like that. It was actually done deliberately. So I've just painted it up, stop it rusting, and that's how it's going to stay. Righty-ho. So I'm now going to try and put the rear wheel in, which I think could be just as difficult as taking it out again. I've still got a face getting rid of all this sticky mess, but I'm not doing that yet. So what I've done is I can't put the front wheel in yet anyway, because one of the spaces is away being chromed, and that won't be back for a few weeks. I've got a rush job on the chroming, which is 5 to 6 weeks, and that's a rush job. They're doing it me as a favour. There's normally sort of about 4 months waiting list on average. I can't put the front wheel in anyway. So what I've done is I've strapped the bike down. I've moved the straps around so you can see the front wheel. Well, the front end of the bike is now down. You know, it's much lower than if I had the front wheel on. And so hopefully having the rear of the bike up much higher than it was before, we should be able to get the rear wheel in without too much trouble. Anyway, but that's what we've done. We've got the front of the bike down really low, so the back of the bike's up high. Of course, as someone mentioned, another alternative is to put wood underneath the main stand to get it up high. But because we've got the front wheel out, we've got that option. I've juggled about with the straps a bit, and so that's what we've got. So, right, I'll have a go at putting that rear wheel back in, and see how we get on. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mount this rear sprocket, because that's separate. It's got its own little stub axle, and put the chain on and the speedo drive. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll see if we can actually fit the rear wheel to it, which I think is going to be difficult. Right, I was just getting ready to put the rear wheel in, and I just thought, oh, I better just check the bearings, wheel bearings. And this left-hand side bearing. It's held in by this sort of peg screw or peg nut or whatever. And I just reached in, and that bearing is a brand new bearing, but it was really stiff. It wasn't turning properly at all. I mean, it was way too stiff, not right at all. So I thought, I can't leave it like that. I know it's not the bearing because it's a new bearing. So I thought, well, I better investigate. So luckily I've got this marvelous peg tool spanner, which has got it's got various sort of pegs on it, different locations for undoing different things. So lucky, because they're a pain to undo these, and you have to put like a drift in and knock it round, which is a total pain. Anyway, so I was able to unscrew it. It's a normal right hand thread, so I just unscrewed it, and there's the bearing, and sure enough it was like really stiff. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. I probably can't, just hang on a minute. So then on this side, this is the spacer shaft, and I realised that was fairly tight. So there's that spigot, you need to make sure that's off, and then you just tap on that, and that pushes, it goes through this bearing, but it pushes against the bearing on the other side. And I just gave it a couple of taps with the copper mallet, and just like 0.5 millimeter, and hey presto, that has freed up. That's perfect. Nice, and turns nice and easily now. So I'm really glad I did that, because it was really stiff, and it certainly wouldn't have done anything to top speed or mileage per gallon. If nothing else, it's possible it might have broken the bearing up. But anyway, I'm really glad to have done that. Simple little thing, but makes all the difference. So now I'm going to put the sort of lock ring back on, and that should be it. Right, yeah, I've also got the new wheel spindle. If you remember, this one, it's got a sort of high spot on it somewhere, and it jams in the in the hub. So goes in, sure enough, it gets about there and it jams solid, and that's why I couldn't get it out. And now, I suppose if I had a lathe or whatever, I could get rid of the high spot, but I haven't got a lathe. And also, in trying to get this out, what I did was, I put my impact driver on it to spin it, to try and, pull it out and strip the tip of the thread. So, there's no way I was going to reuse it. So I've got the new one with a full thread, and, and it goes perfectly. So, there you go. I don't know why, whether that's got a bend in it, or, is it slightly bent, this one, but it's definitely jammed, and that's why I couldn't get the because of course spinning it, all you're doing was just spinning it in the bearing, so it's not in like a normal bolt when you're spinning it, and it's, all it was doing was spinning the actual bearing that it was jammed in. So it was also a bit of a nightmare to get out, because you couldn't leave anything against it. What was happening was it was in here, there, and I just managed to get it out a bit, and it was resting on there, so that when I was spinning this to try and pull it out, all it did, it just wore the thread off. That was as far as I managed to get it out. And then eventually, because of course I couldn't get behind it to push it out, anyway, eventually I managed to get it out, but that's why the thread's gone on that end. No, I mean, luckily, as it were, on that side, the thread doesn't start until a way in, so it hasn't damaged the thread in there. But so I needed a new wheel spindle for two reasons: A, that one doesn't fit, and B, the thread's gone on the end now anyway. So new wheel spindle acquired. Right, let's see if we can get this wheel in now. Right, yeah, so we've got the rear sprocket on, and the new rear chain, and the speedo drive. and that's sort of done up kind of loosely, ready to accept the rear wheel. I'm putting the rear wheel on, by the way, so that I can lock the engine, as it were, stop it turning, because I'm not sure how much I'm going to have to take off of the primary chain to get to try and mend whatever's up with the starter motor. So, starter motor mechanism, I should say. And it could be that I've got, you know, when I either undo or do up these nuts, I've got to lock the back wheel or lock the engine. The easiest way to lock the back wheel. That's why I'm putting the back wheel in now. So I've done all that, and what I've done is I tried to put the back wheel in and failed. So I've actually got the, as you can see, I've got the bike right down at the front now, nearly with the forks touching the bench, so that I can get the wheel in. The problem is I can, with the bike a bit lower down at the back, I can just about get the wheel in with the plate out at the back, this removable plate, which is fine. But then the wheel then sits in the hole, and I'm on my own. It's difficult to lift the wheel up and put the plate back in position, because I want the plate back in, you know, to actually fit the wheel. I need to take that out to actually get the wheel in past the mudguard, but then I want that back in place to actually put the wheel in position. So anyway, so that's why I've taken it right up, and I'm fairly sure now that I can get the wheel will just roll in, and we'll see how we get on from there, because it's still a nightmare even then. And having got the wheel in, I might well have to then bring the back down again, or chop the wheel up so that it's roughly in line, because you know, it'd be impossible to hold the wheel up and try and get that wheel spindle in. I don't know. Right, but I'll anyway, I'll put the camera on the tripod, and we'll actually have a go at seeing if the wheel actually goes in past the mudguard at last. Right. We are now finally ready to put this wheel in place, and with the bike jacked up so high, so high at the back, I'll get it the right side, yeah, and there we go. Just like there, so easy. But of course now I've got the wheel spindle that's 6 inches below, so that's going to be a problem, because of course I've got to get the brake caliper on and everything in line. I've got to try and hold this up while putting the spindle in, but we'll give it a go. So that's all ready to go. And of course, the real problem is to line up. It's lining up these this shock absorber. Whoops! It's lining up these vanes on the shock absorber with the vanes on this rear sprocket. You know, it's a real pain, but we'll do it somehow. It's just a pain of a job. You know, there's no skill involved. It's just pain. Right. Well, I've been at it for about half an hour now. I'm getting absolutely nowhere. Oh, it's a complete nightmare. Anyway, the only use the manual has been to me so far, the workshop manual, is to suggest using the rear chain adjuster from this side to wedge to hold the pads in place, because there, you know, every time you pick that up and try and do anything with it, the pads fall out, won't go on the disc, and so on. So that's about the only use the manual's been so far. Because you know, you've got to try and get this in, but this goes in between it, and then this locating shaft goes on there. You can't just put it on, because you've got to get on the shaft first. You can't put this shaft in afterwards, because the disc's in the way, so it's got to be in there. So like, you put the caliper on, but then you've got to locate it with that, and all the angles are wrong. And at the same time, you're trying to engage this side with the chain wheel. It's just a nightmare. So anyway, I'm going to try again. I'm going to leave the caliper off this time until the end. I'm going to put the what I've done is I've brought the back end of the bike down, so it's roughly now in line, so I'm not having to lift the wheel and so on. Oh dear. Anyway, I'm going to So the next one I'm going to try in loosely inserting the wheel spindle, and then when it's all in position, then try fitting the caliper afterwards. But I'm just worried that, anyway, you know, once you've got that side on, as soon as you pull the spindle out, that side's going to fall off and so on. But anyway, we'll see. Or you know, trying to get the caliper on, it's okay, it goes on there, but then trying to get it on that space at the same time on this is a nightmare. But anyway, we will persevere. I'll get the wheel in loosely with the spindle and try and get it on that rear sprocket first and take it from there. Well, good news and bad news. I finally got the wheel in. Hoorah! Got the caliper on. Phew, nightmare job. But I think basically, yeah, get the chain wheel on, then get the wheel in, put the wheel spindle in. It's a good idea to use this adjuster to hold the brake pads open. Then when the spindle's in, then put the caliper on, engage it with this damned holding nut at the bottom of the shock absorber, and then nightmare lever it so that it goes on that spacer. Oh, excuse me. However, now where the wheel mates up with the chain wheel, there's supposed to be a gap. Okay, but that's too big a gap for me. Right. Obviously, there are two separate bits. There's the wheel on the right here, and there's a chain wheel. But that gap is just too big, which means that the vanes, that everything sort of, the drive is all on the vanes that sort of engage with each other. They're only just like in their slots. So you know, in all honesty, you know, it may be okay, but I'm not. You know, that's a big gap. I don't know if you can see, if I can get, you know, that's a big gap between the two. You know, that's bigger, much bigger, I'm sure, than on my bike. That might be okay, but I'm not sure. So the only thing I can do is, you know, I've tried encouraging them to go closer together without success. So I'm going to have to take, in all honesty, I'm probably going to have to take the whole wheel back off again, because you know, it's not right. I'm sure it's not right. Take the whole wheel back off again. Take the chain off. Take the rear sprocket off. Then with the wheel on the bench and the rear sprocket, mate them together first, and you know, because I'm sure they should mate closer than that, and then that would make this whole thing here easier. And also, I'm not running in the middle. Anything like, I'm only just missing, you know, the caliper, which leads me to think the whole thing's sort of pushed over a bit. I'm not sure, because obviously, but I had to really lever that caliper in, you know. So I'm not sure, but I need to check it. Whatever, it may be okay as it is, but you know, maybe that's the way it is, but you know, I've got to go and check it. So I've got to take the whole damn thing off again. You know, what's that one? What's my mantra? You know, it's Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. You know, if you got to do something, you got to take it all apart again. Then look on it as a learning experience. You know, you learn so much more about the whole thing, perhaps how to put it together properly the next time. And then the whole thing will go together twice as fast as the first time you did it, because you've got an idea of how to do it and one thing or another, and you do get to understand the whole mechanism a lot more. So look on it as a bonus. Take the whole thing off, start again, and maybe, you know, and I think maybe I will find a problem with that. Those vanes, it just doesn't feel right to me. I'm sure they should. They don't stick out very far, those vanes. So at the moment, there's only like 1/16 of an inch of the vanes actually engaging with the wheel, and then all the power for the engine goes through those vanes. So it's not great. Right, okay, I'm going to leave it there for today. Best thing is down tools, have a breather, it's getting late. And come back tomorrow, take the whole damn thing off again and start again. Ho-hum. Okay, so I've had a look at this. And what I think the problem is that this vane is not fully properly seated in the hub. On this side, you can probably see, look, there's a gap between the locking ring and the vane, and that's because the vane on this side is fully down, whereas on this side, you see there's no gap. And though you might be able to see, but the vane is a good sort of 1/8 of an inch proud of the edge of the hub, so the whole vane isn't flat basically, and I think that's the cause of all the problems. So I've got to see if I can get this vane to go in flat. I'm not sure why. I imagine it's stuck on the rubbers or something, but I'll work on it and see if we can get it seated flat. I mean, that rings up tight as far as I know, but well, I'll investigate it. And you know, that's the thing. The actual vane is at a slight angle in the hub. Righty ho. Well, I think I've finally sorted the rear wheel out. I'm finally happy with it. Now, basically, when I put it on first time, I just wasn't happy with it. It just didn't seem to be right. I had a big gap on the between the rear sprocket and the hub, the actual rear wheel, and it looked too big for me, and the whole thing didn't feel right to me. So I took it apart, and basically I should try and describe what I think, you know, was the problem. Now, when I first took the wheel apart, it had that bent or misaligned wheel spindle, which I've replaced, and I'm trying to think if that's something to do with it, but I think it might be a symptom of it. I'm not sure, but that was the sort of first question mark. Anyway, I took it apart, and I realised that the wheel bearing on this side of the hub, was very, very tight. It was very tight. It didn't turn freely. So when I got the wheel out, you take this spacer off here. This has been chromed here, and then that gives you access to the spacer tube. There's a spacer that goes between the two bearings in the hub, and just by tapping on that spacer, it freed up that bearing. Suddenly it turned. But then when I put the wheel back on and everything, it wasn't right. So I took it apart again and I had to think. And this is what I think was happening. The spacer, for whatever reason, because it's a repro part or whatever, I don't know, it is a new spacer, was too long. So because it was too long, it was pushing, it runs on the center, the inner race of the bearing on this side. So it was too long, so it was actually pushing the bearing out. But then, so it was too far this way. But then, if you remember, on the on this hub are the vanes, a sort of metal plate, and there's that peg screw that you use a special tool for doing up. Now that peg screw screws onto the outer race of that bearing, therefore pushing the bearing that way. So the outer race of the bearing was being pushed that way, the inner race of the bearing was being pushed that way. And so that's why when you tighten everything up, the bearing was very stiff, because it was being forced in opposite directions, and also the bearing couldn't go any further that way because the inner race was preventing it. It just simply couldn't. So and that's why this plate, you know, I did it up and I said the vanes, they didn't seem to be flat, because when you tightened up that peg screw, it hit the outside the bearing, couldn't go any further, but it needed to be in further. So what I did was, oh yeah, because then what happens is there's like a spigot, or this side of the wheel spindle then goes against that inner race as well. So that pushes on the inner race from this side. sorry, that pushes from this side. But with the inner race being pushed out too far that way, and it impossible to go in because it was resting on the spacer. So the end of this wheel spindle hit the inner race and couldn't go in any further. And that's why it wasn't close enough, because it was hitting the inner race and it couldn't go in. So what I did was I just took just a little bit off that spacer, and that meant the bearing could go fully home. When I screwed that sort of lock nut in with the peg drive, then it just went in that a little bit further. The whole bearing was therefore going in that a little bit further that way. That meant that this plate with the vanes on it was flat and tightly screwed up. And then when I put the wheel in, it went in, because the last time I did it, because everything was sticking out, I actually had to lever the caliper in, because it just wasn't enough room. Whereas this time the wheel went in, because of course this has been able to go further into the hub, so it's just given that a little bit much more room. And I think that's it. And now everything spins right. I've got a good location. There's a gap there, but it's not too big a gap between the sprocket and the hub. That's as it should be, and I'm happy that everything's okay. So the only thing I can surmise is that maybe that's a remanufactured sort of distance piece, and maybe it just made that 1 millimeter too long, because all I did was just take a sort of millimeter off or whatever, but that seemed to sort everything out. And that's all I can say. Obviously you don't want to take too much off that spacer, because the whole thing should be locked together. So the end of this shaft should be touching the inner race, and then the spacer should be touching the inner race on the other side. So the whole thing, when you do it up tight, is locked together. So if you take too much off that spacer, then you're in trouble, because then this spindle is pushing on the inner bearing, inner race, and there's nothing, and it's taking a massive sideways force. Okay, so that's what I think was happening, and I think I've sorted it. Just a couple of other very minor things to note. The manual was great. I hadn't noticed it before, but they're to say that when you take the caliper off, when you do take the rear wheel off, you take the caliper off, use this tension adjuster, take that off and jam it, because it's sprung loaded and it wants to be out. You can put it in between the brake pads, and it springs out and holds the damn things tight. Because until I did that, every time I tried to get that in, one of the brake pads would fall out, because they literally just fall, they flop about, and you just turn it slightly too much one way and one will fall out, and then the other one will fall out, or whatever. Nightmare. But using that is great. And then you get the caliper on the disc, and just where it's on the disc, then you can pull that out and everything's great. So that was a good one from the manual. The other thing is, I know it's silly, but it's very important, that when you adjust the rear wheel or remove it or whatever, you need to loosen this nut on the shock absorber, because this nut holds the brake plate on for the caliper. And of course, if that's tight, I've just got to repaint some of that which has been worn. If that's tight, then obviously the wheel can't move. So you need to loosen that, either to remove the caliper or to adjust the rear wheel. And then remember to do it back up again. I know it sounds silly, but it's so easy to forget. You're trying to, and then you can bend these adjusters, because you've forgotten to undo that. You loosen the wheel spindle and you can't work out why the wheel's tight, because you've forgotten to loosen that nut, which will move the caliper back. And then don't forget to do it back up again. Okay, phew, that's where we are. Oh, the last thing, another thing is, if you remember, when I took the brake off, the chain off, this split link was on the other side of the chain. Now I can't think why that should be, because I've been running the chain round and it doesn't catch on anything up in the sprocket or anything, so I've left it on that side. I don't know why obviously when Norvil did it, they put the split link and they put it on like they fitted the link the other way around, but I can't see a problem. It's like that on my bike, there's no problem, so I'm leaving it like that.